John, as you know, a long time ago, I did my PhD in brain science, then went bad, became an investment banker. But I've never stopped with this passionate desire to understand what consciousness is. Now I have many people, many of my scientific friends, saying consciousness is an artifact, it's artificial, it is no relationship to reality. It's something constructed by evolution or whatever that is an artificial phenomena that will tell us nothing about what is reality. What sayest you?
Well, I don't think you could go so far as to deny consciousness, because that would be saying that you were sleeping or had been knocked over the head recently or something like that. I'm wondering exactly what these people are saying.
Well, they claim that consciousness is something that we think we have, but it is not a fundamental principle of the world. It's something that came up by accident, but it is nothing even in the remote category of something fundamental like gravity or electromagnetism or the forces of the world. It's something totally separate, and we don't even have to deal with it to understand what reality is.
Oh, I see. Well, they might be right. It might be that you could perfectly well understand most of the world of physics, the world of gravity, the world of electromagnetism, the world of how computers work, that sort of thing, without bothering your head about the nature of consciousness. It could also be that the world has been constructed around consciousness. For example, you could be a believer in God who thought that the world would not have been created at all had it not been for consciousness. And I think you can even defend the theory that nothing could actually be real unless there was consciousness involved.
How would that be?
Well, I used to be very hostile towards that theory because I'd seen a lot of bad proofs offered by philosophers of its rightness. But the idea, I think, is basically this, that it's essential to the nature of reality that reality be something complicated, but all the complexities are all in a single thing. But this demands consciousness. Only consciousness is able to take an entire complicated pattern and make it belong to a single thing. And unless you had consciousness, there would be no complexity in the world. I think that's an argument which can be defended. I've become persuaded that I was just completely wrong earlier in rejecting it.
Now, when you say that, do you mean the human consciousness necessary to understand these physical phenomena? Because I think everybody would agree with that. Or that these physical phenomena are actually an expression of something deeper, and that something deeper is some kind of consciousness?
I mean the second of those. I think that it could be that, for example, the entire structure of the world is a structure thought by an infinite mind. Or it could simply be that you could defend the view that even at the level of very simple systems like atoms, there is a very obscure sort of consciousness, which is needed in order to get the business of complexity into the world. How do you get a complex universe? How do the various parts of it know that the other parts are there, so they can react to the other parts? I think it could make sense to say consciousness is required for this, and that's the sort of view you find in somebody like Alfred North Whitehead, who was a philosopher who managed to get great honors both in philosophy and in physics, but he was rejected by practically all the philosophers and practically all the physicists. But nonetheless, I think is a great brain.
So what that means is that consciousness is a more fundamental part of reality, or is reality and other things are derivative from it?
That could be the case, yes. I think this is a speculative theory, but I don't think it should simply be dismissed out of hand.
Well, it's something that most scientists working today would dismiss out of hand.
Yeah, I think because they haven't thought the matter through. I think they haven't realized that what they are constantly investigating is the structure of the world, such as could be described by mathematics. And therefore, they aren't in the business of deciding what carries that structure, whether, for example, it's carried by a divine mind. If you were a pantheist, you could think that absolutely everything exists inside a divine mind, that the structure of the physical world is the structure of the thoughts in a divine mind. I don't think that this is something you could possibly disprove by any physical experiment.
Well, there are a lot of things you can't disprove that are not provable, granted. But you used an interesting word, carried by. So physical principles, the gravity, electromagnetism, the strong nuclear force, the weak nuclear force, relativity, all these things physicists want to roll up together in the so-called final theory. You're asking a different question. You're asking the question of what are those things carried by?
Yes, I think that there's a difference between a merely possible structure obeying all the laws of gravitation, electromagnetism, whatever, and an actual structure, something existing, something which isn't just in the realm of possibility. And one wants to know, as Stephen Hawking has put it, what has breathed far into the equations, what makes there a real world instead of just a possible world which is described mathematically. And it could be that what has breathed far into these equations has got something to do with consciousness. This is a highly speculative theory, but I think a lot of people have rejected it, either because they haven't even thought of it, or because they have some sort of strange idea that if you thought that consciousness was basic to reality, well, you should avoid kicking a rock because you might give it a nasty pain. Right. That sort of crude interpretation of what I'm trying to say.
Some people have said that when the scientists use phrases like that, breathing fire into equations or the mind of God, that they're being metaphorical. They're using the word God in a very general sense. They really don't mean God. They really don't mean a consciousness. They just mean they're just giving it a grandeur or expression in language that common people understand. But in their heart of hearts, they certainly don't accept that.
Well, I think that could well be right. I think a lot of people who've been talking about, say, seeing the face of God in the cosmic background radiation, just mean we have seen something very basic about the nature of reality, and we want to sell a lot of copies of our book.
Yeah, but that's fine, and I have no objection to that.
Yeah.
But you take this differently. You take this to a very serious level where you're looking, granted you don't say that you are sure, but you are taking this to a deeper level and saying that consciousness is perhaps even more fundamental than these so-called most fundamental laws of physics.
Yes, and as a background to this, I should explain that I'm interested in the general question of what breathes fire into the equations. And I've been pushing a theory which Plato developed, which was that the reason why we have a universe at all instead of a blank is that it is good that there should be a universe, that the existence of the universe is required in a way I'd like to call ethical. There's an ethical requirement which is satisfied by the fact that a universe exists. Now, I myself can't think that the universe would have any value at all, either positive or negative, if consciousness were absent from it. It seems to me that the only value that something like a television set will have is that it brings about states of consciousness in people. When you think that, you wonder why there are in the universe so many things which seem not to be conscious. And one possible reaction to this is, well, they really are conscious in a very low-level way. And another is, all these bits of the universe are simply parts of a structure which is carried in an infinite mind, a mind which knows everything worth thinking about. This is a long way from the original question. Looking at a stone, do you think it's conscious, and so on. But I think this way of thinking isn't crazy.
You've talked about the relationship between a fundamental intrinsic value and consciousness. And I think have expressed the view that you really cannot have intrinsic value without a fundamental consciousness.
Well, I think you can't have intrinsic value actually brought into the world. I think you can have facts about intrinsic value, which would be there in the absence of any consciousness. For example, I think if you had a complete blank, nothing at all existing, no consciousness, then it would be true in that blank that it was a very fortunate thing that a terrible world of suffering in which absolutely everybody was in agonizing pain all the time wasn't in existence.
A net negative world.
Yeah, a world which was just awful. Now, that fact would be a fact about intrinsic value. That's to say that a world of this sort would have terrible negative value. And that sort of fact doesn't depend on anyone's consciousness.
And that fact would have existed even if there were a blank forever.
Even if there were a blank forever, it would be a fact that it was very fortunate that that blank wasn't being replaced by this terrible world. And what would make that world terrible would be the fact that it had consciousness in it. It's not at all clear that consciousness is always of positive value.
Sure, but the typical science approach today is that the substance of reality is neutral on value. It's not positive, it's not negative, it just is. And it's human beings who impose their own sense of what value is on the position where we find ourselves due to anthropological and evolutionary things. And so we impose our own sense of value and then transfer it to anything that we see. There's nothing intrinsic. That's ridiculous.
Well, I think that's a wrong view. I think it's a pitiable view. I tend to be rather rude and think it's a disgusting view, but I have to bear in mind that some of my friends accept this and that they are very intelligent people and very decent people. But I think they just haven't thought things out properly. Are they really thinking that it wouldn't be true until we thought about it, that animals suffering in forest fires before the evolution of human beings were having a terrible time, that their lives could, at those moments at any rate, have negative intrinsic value? If they are really decent people, can they really believe that sort of thing? I suspect this is the sort of thing which people say in front of television cameras or in lecture theatres in philosophy.
I think there's a difference, though, between, sure, an animal suffers, we feel empathy for it, it's terrible, human suffers, is fine, but that has nothing to do with the structure of reality. That's just the fortunate or unfortunate circumstances that beings are in. But whether there's all happiness or all suffering has no relationship whatsoever. Nothing follows from it in terms of what reality is all about. Nothing follows from it. That would be the argument.
Okay, I think in one way that's quite right. It could well be that reality was a product of chance, that the universe just happens to exist, that the universe is not interested in producing values. That's one thing. But another thing I noticed was that you were saying these people would say, these things are just unfortunate. Well, are they serious about it, that it's unfortunate that the animals suffered in forest fires? Do they simply mean, we happen to have imposed the notion that it's unfortunate? Or do they take seriously the idea that it really was unfortunate? I tend to think that if they're decent people, then in their heart of hearts, when they're not in front of television cameras, not lecturing in lecture halls to undergraduates who they want to impress, they will think that it really was unfortunate in itself that the animals were suffering in the forest fires.
I think they would say that. But the next thing is that they would say that feeling, though, was an evolutionary requirement that perpetuated our species, that selected our genes, because those of us who felt that way had better group cohesion or whatever they say. But that in reality, that there is not, the universe is completely neutral, and that we're again imposing on this chance occurrence of negatives or positives our own feelings. But there's nothing about the universe that has any intrinsic consciousness, any intrinsic value, nothing.
Well, again, I'm sympathetic to a lot of that, because I think my own ethical opinions are the result of social pressures and the result of the fact I admire my parents and so on. I accept practically all of what these people accept about why I have the opinions that I do. But one of the opinions that I do have, as a result of all these social pressures and so on, is that out there in reality, it was a terrible thing for these animals to be suffering in forest fires. That is what all these social pressures are getting you to believe. And the people who say the social pressures are getting us to believe it, and we don't believe it, they've contradicted themselves. Because their whole theory is that the social pressures are getting them to believe precisely that.
But they do believe that, but they don't believe that you can go from that fact. They believe they feel that way, but from that fact you cannot infer anything about the universe itself.
In a way, again, I think that's right. You can't infer it, because it could be that the belief which you have here corresponds to no reality. I'm perfectly willing to accept that. It could well be that nothing is in any way better than anything else. And why don't I just then cut my throat? Because cutting my throat is no better than anything else. So that could be. But since I myself want to see point in life, and since all these social pressures, evolutionary forces and so on, have built up in me a belief which allows me to see point in life, I am quite happy to accept this belief and think to myself, well, it's slightly better for me not to cut my throat.
But do you think that puts you in touch with a deeper level of reality, this consciousness that other people...
Not in touch with, because I think talking of being in touch with suggests that there's some sort of ethical searchlight which has been in my brain, which is going to give me the truth, and that this ethical searchlight is acting in the same way as a normal searchlight, or as a scanning beam in an electron microscope or whatever. No, I don't think that. I think that these beliefs which have been given me by evolution and so on might be completely out of touch with the nature of the reality. In the nature of reality, it could be that nothing was any better than anything else. I just want to point out that if that were so, then there'd be no point in believing it, because it wouldn't be better to believe it than not to believe it, you see.
Okay, so that embeds a sort of a self-contradiction in the argument.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, what do you believe?
At the end of the day, I believe some things are better than other things. I believe also that if you want to understand why the universe exists, you ought to take seriously Plato's notion that it exists because it's better that it exists than not, that there was an ethical requirement that a good world exists, and that our world, for all its bad sides, is something good. That's to say, it's something which is a worthwhile part of an infinitely rich situation, which is the supreme good.
And that supreme good would engender consciousness in some way?
The supreme good would itself be the existence of something which was infinitely wide-ranging in its consciousness, which would know, among other things, the structure of our world, because our world is something which is worth knowing about. It makes the grade. It may not be terribly high in making the grade. It may only just have made the grade, but it has made the grade. If you gave me an annihilation machine and said, John Leslie, you can press this button and the whole world will go, I would think it'd be a bad thing to press the button.
But in that cosmology, if you will, which is the more fundamental? The pure consciousness or the, in your term, ethical requirement of the supreme good? Are they one and the same? Does one engender the other? You dig deep to the ground. Which comes deeper?
Neither comes first, because it's like this, that what's ethically required is a good situation, and the good situation is a situation in which there's going to be consciousness. If you take my point that consciousness is the only thing which in the end has any value, either positive or negative. So it's the fact that there's this possibility of having a good situation of consciousness which leads to the requirement that it should actually exist. And the requirement just wouldn't be there unless it were true that there's the possibility of the good of the consciousness existing. Neither comes before the other. It's the one thing supports the other.